Welcome back, everyone, to another lovely class with Dr. Gafni. This is the second session of the Book of Genesis through the lens of ancient biblical interpretation, part 2. This class is a continuation of a Falls Mountain class, the recordings of which are available on YouTube if you would like to catch up with part 1. With that, I'm going to hand over the mic to him.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, or I don't know, good noon in the States. I'll share my screen and we'll start. So let's do a brief review where we're holding. So this yearly course is devoted to a survey of various ancient Jewish interpretations to the Bible with a special focus on the book of Genesis. The goal is both to become more familiar with these texts, but also to see and to get a sense, examine some examples, how the translation is actually carried out, in how our interpretations were actually carried out in ancient times. What have we done so far in this semester, in this course? So we started with intertextual interpretation. It doesn't go by order. We started with intertextual interpretation. We moved on to Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. We discussed the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we moved on to Piyut and rabbinic literature, essentially Midrash. That was what we did in the first semester. Last week, we spoke about vowels and accents, the vocalization and cantillation system, and their contribution for the understanding of the Bible. And what we will do today, we will talk about translations of the Bible. So this is the theme of today's class. And again, it will partly be a more general survey, but also we'll try to explore or demonstrate some of the ideas through verses, mainly from the book of Genesis, from Sefer Bereshit. Okay, so translations of the Bible. Let's just present a very general outline. What are we going to do today? So we'll start with a brief introductions about translations in antiquity in general. We'll proceed and talk about ancient Jewish translations more particular. We'll try to explain or discuss some of the questions that can perhaps provide explanation for the differences between different types of translations. So we'll discuss the context in which the translations were used. We'll talk about differences between oral and written translations, various translation methods, especially literal versus expansive. We'll talk about the biblical text underlying the translation, halachic, theological, and ideological considerations that influence one's translation. And finally, we'll talk about language barriers or language gaps that are also a very important aspect when we deal with translations. So we're going to explore translations from very many different aspects. But we'll start with the introduction. Biblical translations in antiquity. I think it would be right, a fair argument to say that translations are, in a sense, the interpretive genre, which with the closest affinity to the biblical text, meaning there are many forms of interpretation that we explored, but in a sense, translations have the closest connection to the text itself. And why is that? In contrast to other forms of interpretation, translations of the Bible aim to offer an alternative for every component of the original biblical text in a different language, but for every component. So whereas other interpreters might be selective and choose to focus on one word or one theme in the text, translations are obligated to give us an alternative version of the text in a different language, but for every element in the text. So in that sense, translation really maintain a very close connection to the original Hebrew text of the Bible. However, it is important to mention and to emphasize, translations should not be seen as merely a linguistic conversion of the Bible to another language, but it should also be viewed as a form of interpretation. And I'll say the obvious again, I'll ask you, why do we view translations as a form of interpretation? Isn't translation just shifting it from one language to another? Why are translations, almost by definition, are also perceived as a form of interpretation? It's a question. Why are translations a form of interpretation? Why are they not just, Same text in a different language. In what way is it an interpretation? Why do we view translations as a form of interpretation?
Because you always need to make choices.
Right, excellent. Because every text is ambiguous. Words in one language could bear different meanings. There are texts that could be interpreted in various ways. So when you make a translation, I would say by definition, you already make choices how you want to understand the text. In addition to that, in ancient times, as we will see later, people didn't really feel obligated to translate everything according to or be loyal to the original text. They very often allow themselves to elaborate and to add stuff into their translations. So in that sense, ancient translations are way beyond, at least some of them are way beyond translation, a technical translation to a different language. I checked it before class. Into how many languages has been the Bible translated, at least up to this day? You want to take a guess? I tested the AI, so I got different answers every time I was asking. But what number will you give? How many languages has the Bible been translated into?
Many hundreds.
Many, many hundreds. That's a good guess. So I saw it today. We know something at least close to 800 languages. So the Bible is a fairly, it received many, many translations. I don't know how many other books out there were translated to so many languages. And this is nowadays. And again, every time I check the AI, I get a different number, but it's usually around that figure. However, it's not something modern. Even in antiquity, there are already a wide variety of biblical translations into different languages. So this is a book I recommend if you're Hebrew speakers, or if you could read a book in Hebrew. It's not the latest composition, but a latest book, but it's a nice introduction to various translations of the Bible. So that's the book you see here on the screen. In any event, and this book discusses both Jewish and Christian translations. So in the Christian world, again, in antiquity, the Bible was translated mainly into Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac. Those are the most famous languages that we know of. There were other languages as well, but those are the dominant languages that the Bible was translated in antiquity by Christian churches, by Christian communities. In the Jewish context, we know of mainly essentially translations of the Bible into Aramaic and into Greek. Those are the two languages that the Bible was translated into within the Jewish community. This is, again, a very general description. I'm sure there are more nuances and details that could be added here. When I say here a Christian Greek and a Jewish Greek, because it's not necessarily the same translation, we could be speaking about different versions, different translations of that same text. So what are the dominant Jewish translations of the Bible that we know of? So we'll mention here a bunch of them. I just want to say one more thing. Usually when we purchase a copy of the Bible, or even in antiquity, when people copied the Bible in a form of translation, they would include one translation or one version. However, there were already in antiquity, and certainly later on with the invention of print, there were some editions of the Bible that even back then included more than one version or more than one translation. In such editions, you would have one column designated for the Hebrew original text, and on the margin you will see, or next to it, you will see other columns with numerous other translations of the text. So this is one example. What you see on the screen here, you see 4 columns of 4 different languages. This is another polyglot, many or numerous languages together. So this is another edition of the Bible where you see many translations, one next to the other. Most manuscripts, again, are devoted to one translation, but sometimes you will find numerous translations, one next to the other. So what are the most dominant, most famous translations of the Bible within the Jewish context in antiquity? So I want to refer to 4 important translations that one probably should be familiar with. The first one is The Septuagint, that's probably one of the most ancient translations of the Bible, produced by Jews, perhaps in the 2nd century BCE. There's a famous legend about the formation, about the creation of this translation. And this is what the legend says. Adina, you want to read? It happened
that King Ptolemy brought together 72 elders and placed them in 72 separate rooms without telling them why he had brought them together. And he went into each one of them and said to him, "Translate for me the Torah of Moses, your master." God then gave each one of them wisdom, and they all conceived the same idea.
Okay, so this is the very famous legend that surrounds the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Bible. Although scholars speculate or suspect if this legend is accurate, but the timing of the translation is agreed upon most scholars. We're talking about 2nd century BCE, at least the Torah. And it's also agreed that it's a Jewish translation and not a non-Jewish, whatever type of translation, although it became a very dominant text among Christians later on. But this is one of the most ancient translations of the Bible into Greek. The word Septuagint comes from the number 70, although in this tradition you see that it was actually 72 sages. The next translation we will address is the Aramaic translation of Onkelos. Here too, we're talking about a very important Jewish translation. However, this time it's not into Greek, but rather into Aramaic. And I just want to mention one tradition that describes this translation that appears in the Talmud in Masechet Megillah. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah ve'itema Rabbi Chia bar Abba, so Rabbi Jeremiah, or some say Rabbi Chia, the son of Abba, said, Targum shel Torah, Onkelos hager amaro mipi Rabbi Eliezer veRabbi Yoshua. The Targum of the Torah was composed by Onkelos, the convert, under the guidance of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. If we assume that this translation is what we call today Targum Onkelos, so that would place this translation in the 2nd century CE. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua are 2nd century sages, and it would also locate the translation in Eretz Israel, in Palestine. That's the dating and the location that you would come up with if you follow this tradition. I would point out that in scholars who analyzed the translation actually concluded that it's a Babylonian dialect, Aramaic dialect, and not a Palestinian one. So that's one of the mysteries that still remains with regards to this translation. Another piece of information we learned is that Onkelos, the translator, was a convert. This is another important tradition. And finally, one last thing, and here I did not include this in the presentation, there's a Palestinian Talmud, or Yerushalmi, where the same sage appears as the author of a translation. He's called Akilas rather than Onkelos, and he's also supposedly have translated under the guidance of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. One of the big questions is that over there, it's referred to as a Greek rather than Aramaic translation. So these are some of the questions, some of the question marks surrounding this translation. For our purposes, what we need to know, Onkelos is an Aramaic translation from early antiquity. The next translation that we will encounter in Jewish sources, along with the Septuagint and Onkelos, is the following one, a translation that is called Pseudo-Jonathan. Why pseudo and why Jonathan? So here too, we have some problems with the history of this translation. In many, many editions of the Tanakh, if you open up Mikraot Gdolot, so if you would open up a copy, you'll pick up a copy of the Torah with a selection of interpreters, you will see that there's one of the paragraphs will be devoted to Targum Yonatan ben Uziel. It will be titled as the Targum, the translation of Yonatan ben Uziel. However, the tradition that attributes the Targum to this sage called Yonatan ben Uziel, who was also an early 1st century sage, is very problematic. because the Talmud in Tractate Megillah again clearly says that Yonatan ben Uziel, the sage named Yonatan ben Uziel, only translated the prophets. The Talmud says very clearly the Targum of the prophets was composed by Yonatan ben Uziel under the guidance of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And the land of Israel was shaking over an area of 400 parsas by 400 parsas, and the heavenly voice came out and explained, who is it that has revealed my secret to mankind? So according to the Talmud, this sage, Yonatan ben Uziel, only translated the prophets, not the Torah. For that reason, and for many, many other reasons as well, scholars concluded that what we call the translation of Yonatan ben Uziel to the Torah on the Pentateuch is not actually Yonatan ben Uziel's translation. It's just a Palestinian ancient Aramaic translation. It's not Yonatan ben Uziel, because Yonatan ben Uziel, if he had translated anything, it was the prophets and not the Torah. That's why among scholars, you would hear people refer to it as Pseudo Jonathan, or in Hebrew, Hameyuchas Yonatan ben Uziel. It's just attributed to him, but it's probably not his own translations. What we have as Yonatan ben Uziel's translation to the Torah is probably not his. In the 19th century, there was a scholar who suggested that it's a mistake, that the mistake came up because of the usage of the acronyms Taf Yud. They used to refer to this translation as Targum Yerushalmi, Targum like Palestinian Targum, and somebody took it to mean, rather than Targum Yerushalmi, somebody thought it was Targum Yonatan, and that's why people started attributing the Targum, the translation of the Torah, to this Jonathan ben Uziel. So I'm summarizing. So far, we spoke about Septuagint, a Greek translation, 2nd century BCE. Onkelos, an Aramaic translation, 2nd century CE, according to the Talmud in Palestine, according to scholars perhaps in Babylon. Third translation, called Pseudo-Jonathan, although in many editions of Mikraot Gdolot it will be attributed to Yonatan ben Uziel, given that the Talmud says that he did not translate the Torah, but only the prophets, scholars assume that it's not really his. It's just a Palestinian translation of the Torah into Aramaic that by mistake was attributed to him. Last translation I will refer to in this brief survey is a less known translation that was discovered fairly late, and that's called Neophiti. Neophiti is less known than the other ones, and it's an Aramaic translation, also 1st, 2nd century CE, but it's a different version. It's not identical neither to Onkelos nor to Pseudo-Jonathan. It's a third important Aramaic version of the Torah. This text was only published in 1956, so it was a fairly late publishing date for this text, but it's also considered one of the important Aramaic translations that existed in antiquity. Okay, we didn't discuss all the translations, but the main ones that one needs to be familiar with, we're familiar with now. Targum HaShivim, Septuagint, Onkelos, Pseudo-Jonathan, and the Neophiti. Now, that we know the important names, I want us to a little bit look into the translations themselves, and what we will do is we'll present some questions and also look into some examples. Ancient translations of the Bible differ not only in their language, but also in many other aspects, meaning, and when we compare different translations in antiquity, they're not going to be different just that one is in Greek and one is in Aramaic. They also have other important, substantial differences in their way, in their method of their translation. What we will try to explore in the remaining part of our class is the following questions. What are the causes for these differences? Why do different translators translate the same text in different manners? What could be the causes for differences between different types of translations? More specifically, what are the factors that shape the style of each translation, right? If we want to understand the differences, we also need to ask what makes a translation appear in a certain way? What shapes the nature or what gives the style of each translation? What differentiates it from other types of translations? What are the main challenges that translators were facing? These challenges are often the reasons why different translators will go in different directions. What are the causes for deviating from the original Hebrew text, and what circumstances where translators ought or felt forced to abandon the original text and adopt a different, or to provide something that is slightly different? So when we talk, essentially what I'm trying to say is we're going to examine the different reasons why translators are not providing us with something identical to what the original text is. And if we can understand the factors that shape each translation, the challenges that lead translators to adopt different ways, that would also give us some explanation as to why are different translations, why are certain translations different one from the other. So what types of issues we're going to bring? We're going to bring a few different factors that shape or that impact the type of translation that influence the nature of each one of those texts. So the first question I want to bring up involves the context. Scholars like to discuss when they analyze, when they study different translations, they want to understand what scholars often refer to as the Zitzum Leben, meaning the historical context, the cultural context in which each text emerges, and also in the case of translations. What could explain gaps or differences between different translations is the location or the context, the cultural or historical context in which each translation was being used. From rabbinic literature, it is possible to discern a dual use of biblical translations. Some translations appear to be something a bit maybe more public that accompanies the reading of the Torah in the synagogue, meaning something more public and more popular in a sense, whereas other sources discuss the Targum, the translation, as material that was really meant for Beit Midrash. And when I say Beit Midrash, I mean for more sophisticated crowd. These are two different types of translations. It's not the same when you provide a translation for simple people who are just coming to the shul to hear the Torah laning once a week, or if you're dealing with people who are going to be studying your translation systematically and get into all the finest details. That is the context, the reality in which each translation emerges can often explain differences between certain translations, between independent translations. In the Talmud, as I said, in rabbinic literature, we see that the translations function in different contexts. In some places, it is clear that the translation accompanies the reading of the Torah. Here you see in the Mishnah in Masechet Megillah. This is just an example that we see that sometimes the Targum, the translation, was used in a synagogue setting. Popular crowd. One who reads the Torah in public may not read less than 3 verses, and he should not read to the translator more than 1 verse at a time. So here we see the translation is part of the performance in the synagogue. When people read the Torah, they would accompany the verses with translation. Did any of you ever go to a Yemenite synagogue in Israel or out of Israel? So the Yemenites, even nowadays, read the Torah with a translation. They read a verse Hebrew and then a verse in Aramaic. So this is one type of translation. These translations probably tended to be more popular. The translators are more careful. They don't want to provide or expose their crowd to sophisticated ideas or things that would puzzle them. As a matter of fact, the Mishnah even says that certain passages were not translated. They were censored in the synagogue. Ma'aser Reuven nikra velo mitargem. The incident of Reuven that had slept with Bilhah was not translated. Ma'aser Tamar nikra v'mitargem. They were selective. There are certain passages that might have been censored. Certain ideas were not revealed to the crowd. This is a very extreme step. We see this in manuscripts. By the way, some translations just skip certain parts. whereas others will give us the entire translation. Needless to say, if they're willing to skip certain passages, they might also translate text in a more moderate fashion, in a more conservative way, rather than presenting things in a very bold and extreme form that might be confusing for the simple people in the congregation. So the context, Beit Knesset versus Beit Midrash, synagogue versus Beit Midrash, might have impact, might influence the nature of a translation. Other sources, I'm not going to read this text, but other sources discuss the Targum in a more of a learned community as part of one's curriculum. You're supposed to study the Targum. These types of Targumim might be more sophisticated, meant for more sophisticated type of crowd. In a similar, maybe related to the first question of the context, scholars also discuss different translations and speculate whether some of them were meant to be performed orally, in contrast to other translations who were supposed to have been transmitted in a written form. Oral translations and written translations are also not the same. Translations that were meant to be performed in front of a crowd in an oral manner might sound different than ones that are meant to be documented in a written form from the very beginning. Once again, I want us to see it in Chazal, in rabbinic literature. We see that in synagogues, often the translations were not being read from a written book, and the translator was not even allowed to look at the Torah scroll. So somebody might even think that he's reading the translation from a document. It was all performed orally. Here we see in the Midrash, the rabbis being asked, what is the rule regarding someone who looks in the Torah scroll and translates? Our rabbis taught the one who translates is forbidden to look into the Torah scroll and translate, so that people will not say that their translation is written in the Torah. So some translations were, by definition, meant to be recited orally. This, just like the question of synagogue versus Beit Midrash, more popular or more sophisticated, the question of oral versus written also might have impact on the way that the translation was, the way the choice of words or the form of translations that each translators would come up with. I want to show you an interesting example that reveals the difference between what possibly would be a written translation in contrast to an oral translation. I brought this example from the book of Numbers because it's a better example. The Torah says here in Sefer Bamidbar, a second, Ki li kol bechor biyom akoti kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim hikdashti li kol bechor b'Yisrael me'adam ad behema li hiyu ani Hashem. In English, because all the firstborn are mine, for on the day that I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I hallowed to me all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. Mine shall there be. And what's the end of the verse? Ani Hashem. Literally, I am the Lord, right? In some translations, it would sound like this. In Onkelos, for example, Arei dili kol buchra, ana Hashem. Just like Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. In Surah Jonathan, also, Ana Hashem, I am the Lord. But look what we find in the Neofiti, the third translation, or the last translation I mentioned before. In such translations, we don't have Ana Hashem, but we have Amar Hashem. Arum lishmi inun kol buchrei, Amar Hashem. Why would a translator choose to adopt the words Amar Hashem rather than Ana Hashem? Here you see the manuscript of the Ktav Yad Neofit. You see at the end, Amar Hashem. This is the full verse. This is from the manuscript. Why would somebody choose to say Amar Hashem and not Ana Hashem? The text, the original text, the formulation of the Torah is Ani Hashem. So why transfer that into Amar Hashem? Scholars suggest the Neofiti translation is probably an oral form of translation. It was a translation that was performed orally. And what happens if if somebody's reading the Torah and I'm translating the text and I'm saying, Ana Hashem, I am God? That sounds pretty bad. What am I? Even if I don't mean that, but it sounds as if I'm referring to myself as God. Such translations had to be more careful. And then the translators prefer to say, Amar Hashem. That's what God has said. Not I am God, but rather, end of quote, from God. Amar Hashem. Those are the words of God. The small nuance, Ana Hashem, I am God, versus God has said, could be a reflection of different types of translations. Something that is more written, documented, meant to be read, in contrast to something that is being recited orally that still bears this indirect connection with the audience. And that's why there's a more need of to be careful. In the Neophyte, this is a very common feature. Very often, it would not refer, the translator will not speak about himself in a way that is confusing. When Moshe speaks in the Torah, he will make clear that it's not me speaking, it's Moshe speaking in a similar manner. So we spoke so far about two important factors that might influence or shape different translations: the type of audience they're speaking to and the format in which the translation is being used, orally versus in a written form, in a book. These two questions obviously might be connected to each other. Additional factors. The most obvious one, what causes different types of translations? The degree of commitment of the translator to the original text. This is a big topic, and we're not going to cover this entire theme, but I want to bring us at least one sentence from Chazal that in a sense conveys the biggest dilemma, or that bears or reflects the greatest dilemma of any translator. Second, in Tosefta, in Tractate Megillah, we find the following sentence. I think it's a beautiful sentence because it captures the biggest question or the biggest dilemma of any translator. Hametargem pasuk ketzurato, harei ze badai. V'hamosif, harei ze megadef. You want to read in English? Adina, you're my English reader. Rabbi Judah says,
one who translates a verse literally, behold, he is a liar. And one who adds to what is written, behold, he is a blasphemer.
So we see this is the biggest dilemma of every translator. On the one hand, you want to be as close as possible to the original, but you can't actually translate it word by word from one language to another, because every language has its own style, its own grammar, its own unique choice, way of choosing words. Sometimes when you do a Google Translate in a non-professional program, every word is translated, but the text means nothing. So what is your other choice? So if you remain literal, it means nothing. He's a liar, because that's not what the text is really saying. So what's your alternative? You say, I'm not going to be translating it word by word. I'll try to give the sense, the ideas. But once you do that, you start making up stuff. You already are reading what you think the text is saying. So this is a very subtle question that every translator of any book faces. What should I do? Too literal is not what the text means. It's incoherent. Try to explain what I think the text means to say. I'm already becoming a little bit more subjective. I'm already introducing or attributing to the text some of my own personal observations, what the text from my perspective is saying, and maybe not what the text actually says. This is a very big question that translators always face. And this is also an issue that would often explain different types of translations. In modern scholarship, there's endless literature on trying to distinguish or to classify different types of translations. So different biblical translations adopted varying approaches regarding their adherence to the language of the original text. Some preferred more literal, others allowed themselves stylistic freedom, and some even add more than stylistic. They just feel comfortable to add words, even sentences every now and then. Here you see a diagram that somebody produced here from the most literal, faithful, balanced, idiomatic, and free. Or another way of trying to classify. Here you see a full scale or full description of different types of translations, and below you have all sorts of English translations, and you see that some of them are word for word, possibly incoherent, and some of them are, the other extreme is to provide a paraphrase of the text, but that already becomes a very speculative type of translation. So this is a very subtle question, and ancient Jewish translations are also struggling with these type of questions, and each one also must adopt or choose or determine where does he want to fit. Is he more blue or more red or green, yellow, somewhere in between? This is another reason. I chose one technical example to demonstrate this type of difference. In Sefer Bereshit, before the slave of Abraham leaves the house of Laban, so he asks them, if you want to be nice to my master, tell me, and if not, hagiduli ve'efne al yamin or al smol, and if not, tell me so that I may turn to the right or to the left. When the words right and left appear in the Bible, they very often don't mean right and left the way we use it, but it actually means different directions. South, not south. Usually it's either north or south are often referred to as right and left. So how do you translate this type of text? You can be more literal, like we see here in the Septuagint. He chose to translate the words, I may turn to the right hand or to the left. That's one way. That's a literal translation, but it doesn't capture what the slave is saying, because he really means to say, am I going to go north or south? However, and in a similar way, you see here in Onkelos, Yamina or Smala. But what do you see in Surah Jonathan? You see, he doesn't translate right and left. What does he choose? South and north, right? Or so which is the right translation? You want to be literal? It's right and left. From a linguistic perspective, a literal translation is yamin or smol. But it's not really what the slave meant to say. He doesn't mean yamin or smol. He means north or south. So which is the right translation? One translator chooses to be more technical, literal, perhaps losing some of the idea, and the other one allows himself more freedom, but then it doesn't sound like the original formulation of the text itself. This is a technical, tiny example that gives us a sense of these type of dilemmas that translators are facing. The next issue, we're exploring all sorts of themes, and obviously we're just doing the very, very beginning of getting some senses what type of issues one needs to consult or think about when you examine translation. Another important factor that often explains deviation from the original Hebrew that we have in front of us, and sometimes also explain gaps between different types of translation, is that they're not necessarily working or translating the same original text. It is an issue that one needs to take into account. When you see different translators, it could be a matter of method, more literal or more freedom. It could be an issue of oral versus written, public versus popular versus something more sophisticated, but it could also be a result of different translators working off a different text. You can't always assume that the translators are translating what we have in front of us in the common versions, in the prevailing versions of the Torah. Sometimes they might be translating a text that might be slightly different. That explains their deviations from what we have, and that also explains why they could be different one from the other. I want to show you one example, a very known example. It says by the story of the binding of Isaac. Vayisa Avraham et einav, vayar v'ine ayil, achar ne'echaz basvach bekarnav. Right? After God stops him from sacrificing his son, he lifts his eyes and he sees this ram. Achar ne'echaz basvach bekarnav. How will he translate it, achar? It's a hard word. What would you suggest? What is achar?
Behind, but that doesn't work. So
What
like
did you say? What did you suggest? I didn't hear you. What did you
I said
suggest?
behind, but it's not quite behind, but whatever. It's like a little way away. I think like the
It's a
picture that
hard
you
word.
gave.
You're
Yeah.
you're you're facing a difficult word. It's not right that I'm putting you. It's a difficult question. What do we read here? So in many translations, you will see the word achar to mean behind him. Right. This is in English. I chose just one example of one of many English translations. Sometimes people say achar is not about the location, but in time-wise, afterwards. Achareichen, afterwards. So it's either referring to the location or referring to the timing. After he lifted his hands, he saw this ram, or he saw a ram acharav, behind him. This is what we would translate. In Unkelus, we have the word batar, which means after, but we have another word that is a little bit confusing. He says, Vayar v'ne'ayil, uzkaf Avraham yat inoi, so Abraham lifted his hands, batar eilin, after that, v'chaza, v'ha dichra chad, he lifted his hands, and here he sees dichra as an ayil, chad. Where did this chad come from? What is chad in Aramaic?
One.
One. Where did that come from? In other translations, you only have that chad. In Surah Jonathan, uzkaf Avraham yat inoi, Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, v'ha dichra chad, and he saw one ram. He adds here that this ram was created on the eve of creation of Ben Hashmashot. That's a separate edition. But again, dichra chad, also in the. So what would you speculate? Where did this chad come from?
Came from the fact that the Resh and the Dalet look so damn similar.
Right,
Basically
exactly.
all the
Scholars
alphabets
suggest
from forever.
right. So scholars suggested perhaps he's working off a different text. Maybe he didn't have Vine Ayil Achar, but rather, what would you read in Hebrew? Vine Ayil Echad. Possible. Maybe they're working off a different Hebrew text. Indeed, in the Samaritan version of the Bible, we find Vine Ayil Echad. So is it possible that the translations are working with a different text? Onkelos seems to be a little bit confusing because he does have the word batar, which comes from the achar, after, but he also has the chad. So maybe it's a combination of two versions that got somehow stuck together. But the chad reading is clearly alluding to the words vine ayil echad. Same is found in the Septuagint, one ram caught by his horns. There's even a verse in Daniel resembling our text in Genesis with the word ayil echad. Va'isa enai va'er'eh v'ine ayil echad. It sounds very much like the story of Abraham. Va'isa Avraham et einav va'yar v'ine ayil. But here we don't have achar, we have echad. Amazing. So sometimes when you come across something, an awkward translation, you must take into account maybe there's a different text that he's translating. Maybe the text that we have in front of us is not necessarily the same text that your translator is using, and that could be the cause of deviations from the original, and that could also be the cause of differences between independent translations. Maybe they're not working off the same text. We're continuing. We don't have a lot of time left, but we need to do a few more things. From now on, I want to talk about various considerations that also might influence different translators. And you will sense that a lot of these questions that I'm raising here might be connected one to the other. I'm starting with halachic considerations. Halakha, Jewish law, developed in certain ways. And very often, halakha is not really, I would say, is not an expression of the literal sense of the psukim. And translators are facing this dilemma. Should they translate the psukim more literally, or taking into account the way that the rabbis eventually decided to translate these verses? We're giving this example. And this is a nice example that shows, that reflects how some translators felt the need to take into account the rabbinic interpretation of a text, the way that halakha decided how to understand certain laws in the text. This verse, as I promised you, is from Genesis. Shofech dama adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. Ki b'tzelem Elohim asa et adam. So who wants to do the English?
Whoso sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man.
So when you read the words, by man shall his blood be shed, you can understand it could be referring to his family member. If a certain person kills his friend, any person can come and just stone him or do whatever he wants to him. By man shall his blood be shed. In Onkelos, in the Aramaic translation of Onkelos, we see a very important addition. The Yeshod Dama de Enasha, who's sheds man's blood, Besahadin al Meimar Dayanat Meit Asher Ichad. By witnesses, upon the sentence of the judges, his blood shall be shed. Onkelos does not want to leave the impression that if somebody sees or encounters a case of murder, he has the right to pull his gun and start shooting. No. It has to be done following the norms of halakha. So he added words into the text here. It has to be done besahadin. Sahada is like witness. By the way, just like the word in Arabic, shahid, a person who's willing to kill himself for the belief of Islam is called shahid, a witness, like a martyr in English.
Better also.
So a person. So we need to have witnesses, and we also need to have dayana, judges. So this is a halachic consideration, a legal consideration, meaning the need to translate following the norms of halakha of Chazal that influence the way of Onkelos, the way Onkelos chooses to translate this text. In contrast to Onkelos, there's another Palestinian Talmud we didn't discuss so much, Targum Yerushalmi. He just translates this more literally. He felt that in this case, he does not need to add the words bisahadin al meimar dayana. What could be the causes for this? Perhaps more literal translation. Perhaps he's dealing with more sophisticated crowd that can handle the verse as is. Whereas Onkelos feels the need to consider what Chazal are saying. Maybe he's speaking to a crowd in a synagogue. Maybe he's preaching to a popular audience, and he needs to make it clear: do not kill anyone that you just because you are exposed to a case of murder. The next example also belongs to this same realm, and look, and here we see alternative traditions within Targum Onkelos. If you recall, Judah, the son of Jacob, saw a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he decides to marry her. That's what we learn in Genesis 38. This sounds problematic because we know that the forefathers, and also in later halakha, did not really encourage people to marry non-Israelites and certainly not Canaanites. Abraham made it very clear to his slave, Lo tikach isha livni bibnot haKna'ani. You shall not take a wife to my son of the daughters of Canaanite. So you're not supposed to get married with these Canaanites. So how can Judah violate this type of halakha? You could say, if you were a literal translation, you would just maintain Canaanite and you'll just leave this as a question. But when you examine the translation of Onkelos, you'll see something interesting. He translates, rather than Canaanite in a literal way, he says, B'chazat Haman Yehuda. So Judah saw there, Bat Gvar Tagara, the daughter of a merchant. How did the word Knaani become a merchant? There is, right, the Chagor Natna
La Knaani.
La Knaani. So there is a rare meaning of the word Knaani, a rare interpretation in the Bible for Knaani as a merchant. And Onkelos here, in some versions, tries to avoid saying that Judah married a Canaanite by translating this word Canaanite in a very rare, using a very rare interpretation of this or understanding of this word that appears only in Proverbs somewhere, in order to avoid assuming that Judah marries a Canaanite daughter. I brought this example because here you see two manuscripts of Onkelos, and they're not identical. In the right-hand side, you see that it's a translation of Onkelos where you still see the word Knaani, Canaanite. But in the left-hand side, what do we see? Gevar Tagara. So sometimes even in Onkelos, we have two traditions. Who did Judah marry? Was he marrying a Canaanite or a Gvar Tagar? If you look into Pseudo-Jonathan, so look what Pseudo-Jonathan did here. V'chama taman Yudah, so Judah saw there, Barat Gavar Tagar. So he too translates Knani as a merchant, Tagar a merchant. But look what he added. Ushmei Shua, and her name is, the merchant's name was Shua. Vegira ve'alevata. So he's playing it safe. He added another word. In addition to saying that she was just a merchant's daughter and not a Canaanite, what did he also add? If you have any questions, he converted her. Don't worry, he went to the Rabbanut. They did everything by the book. Don't even think, don't even suspect that Judah was not following halacha. This is another example. Few more themes, and our time is going to be up. We spoke about halacha. It's also about theology. This is perhaps the most famous feature of onkelos. Onkelos is trying to avoid in any way any physical attributions to God. God does not have a body, and you cannot describe him using any metaphors that are coming or that originate from the physical world. So if it says in the Torah, after Noah brings his sacrifices after the story of the flood, Vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoach, Vayomer Hashem el libo, Lo'osif lekalelot et ha'adama ba'avur ha'adam. And the Lord smelled the sweet Savior, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground. What does that mean? Does God smell? Does God have a heart? What does Onkelos say here? God does not smell. When the Lord received with approval, God does not smell because he doesn't have a nose. If we don't want to have anybody mistake here, we translate this, we go around. And rather than saying God smells, lehariach, God just received. Also, God does not have a heart. So the Lord said in his word, b'meimrei, not in his heart, because God does not have a heart. So theology and halacha are very important elements in some translations. The attempt to make the translation kosher, both from a legal perspective or from a theological perspective, is a very important factor that explains deviations from the original text and also distinctions or differences between alternative translations. One could be more frum and one could be more liberal. One could be more literal and one feels the need to be more apologetic and make clear that there are no theological or halachic problems that come up in the text. We're going to talk about two more themes and then our time probably will be up. Ethical considerations. This is again about the image of the forefathers. From the translation's perspective, the forefathers are perfect, at least in many of the translations, and that also affects what they're saying. And especially, but here this is even a more complicated example because the text itself leads to a problem. When Abraham is informed that he's going to have a son, he's 100 years old. The text says, "Vayipol Avraham al panav vayitzchak." Abraham fell on his face, and literally translating, he laughed. He was laughing about this when he heard this information that he's going to have a son when he's 100 years old. A few verses later, Sarah is also informed that she's going to give birth, and she also laughs. But whereas with Abraham, God does not say anything. When it comes to Sarah, God is upset with her. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Why is God upset with Sarah, not with Abraham? Didn't they both laugh in the same manner? Why is Abraham not being criticized for laughing after hearing God's promise that he will have a son? And Sarah is being even punished perhaps for laughing after hearing these good news. Translators are facing this issue, this question, this problem in the text, and they're also, I think, trying to defend Abraham and not present him as somebody who was laughing hearing God's new promise. So when you will look in the translations, you will see a difference. When they talk about Sarah, the Onkelos is translating Vechadi. Abraham was happy, he rejoiced. But when they translate Sarah, they don't say chadi, happy, but they say chiecht, which means laughed. So you take the same word, but you translate it in different ways in order to make sense of the text, and also in order to distinguish between. So you make sense of the text. Why is God criticizing Sarah and not Abraham? But you also are making Abraham look better. Abraham did not laugh when he heard God's promise. He believed it. He was actually accepting God's promise. In the Pseudo-Jonathan's translation, he's adopting another way. He's trying to deal with this problem in another way. The Septuagint has its own way, but for our purposes, we can just discuss the Onkelos' translation. Ideological factors. Very often, translators, as in the previous example, are introducing or reflecting their own ideological considerations into the translation, especially when they're trying to distinguish between Jews and non-Jews, between secular and divine. A few examples for that. And here I want to recommend an amazing book that is devoted to these type of differences, a book named Parashah. It's an excellent composition, excellent series on the Onkelos translation that he deals with these particular examples. The word mincha. Mincha is used in many, many cases. Sometimes among people, the brothers bring Joseph mincha, but we also have in our Parashat Shavua mincha that is being brought in the temple through the priest. Onkelos and many other translations will not use the same translation for the identical word mincha. When we're talking about people, and especially when it's not in a Jewish context, it's just translated as tikruvta. Tikrovet also in Hebrew just means a present. But when you bring a sacrifice, it becomes minchata. You don't want to use the same word for divine or secular. And by the same token, as I said, you want to distinguish between words when they're used in a Jewish context or in a non-Jewish context. Look at the word mizbeach. This is what you see on this screen. When we translate mizbeach in a Jewish context, in a divine, holy Jewish context, it's always translated midbacha. Daled and Zayin switch, so it's mizbacha, midbacha. But when we're talking about Gentiles who are having their altars for for idolatry purposes, the word is not the same word. You will have agorehon. Agorehon is the word for an altar when we're dealing with a non-Jewish altar. Same word, different translations. These are the type of ideological considerations that some translators include in their work. They want to make clear distinctions between certain words, even if it's an identical word. One last example. How do you say priest? It depends. Is it a Jewish priest or a non-Jewish priest? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, emor el kohanim b'nei Aaron. Kohanim, when it comes to Jews in the temple, it's kahanaya. But when we deal with kohanim that are non-Jewish priests or non-Jewish figures, like in Egypt, when we also have kohanim in Egypt, they're not called kohanim. They're actually translated as kumaraya. Like in modern Hebrew, when you say a Christian priest, you say komer. So the same kohen is not the same translation when you deal with Jews and with Gentiles. These are another set of considerations that one needs to take into account. I want to summarize, and one more, with that we'll almost be done. What we were trying to do today is talk about the idea of translation as a form of interpretation, and I think that our examples reveal that very clearly. It's not a technical work to translate. You're not just shifting from language one to language two. There's a lot of impact on the work of translators. When a translator is translating a text, he has a lot of impact and a lot of influence on how he wants this text to sound. We spoke about some Christian, but mainly ancient Jewish interpretations and Jewish translations. And what we were trying to explain is what could be the factors that lead to deviations from the original text? What could be the factors that explain different type of works, different types of translations. We spoke about the context, synagogue versus Beit Midrash. We spoke about written versus oral. We've spoken about different methods. Do you want to be more literal? You lose something, or expand, but maybe you're already becoming more speculative. We spoke about various considerations that are also out there. Legal considerations, theological considerations, ideological agenda that you have. And we also took into account or raised the possibility that different translators are working off different texts. All these things make translation into a fascinating work. And when you read and you study the Torah with the translations, you can really learn so much reading each translation independently, but also even more so when you compare different translations and you get to appreciate how much impact that these translators have on our understanding or on their understanding of this text. That's for today. On next session, we'll talk about Jewish Hellenistic literature, and we'll talk about Philo maybe and Josephus a little bit, and then we'll have some sort of a summary for the entire series. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gafni. Thank you, everyone. Be safe and looking forward to next week.
Okay, thank you.